Right. Thank you everyone for joining today. This is Ensuring Due Process for Asylum Seekers, Las Americas Credible Fear Interview Orientation Project, a guide for administrative agencies, legal service providers, and philanthropy. Your speakers for today are Jorge Dominguez, fellow attorney with Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center. Jorge Dominguez was born and raised in El Paso, Texas. Jorge graduated from the University of Texas at El Paso with a Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice in the fall of 2018. He recently became officially an attorney in the state of Texas. Jorge initially interned with Las Americas as a law student and eventually becoming a fellow for the Detained and Deportation Defense Program in April 2023. Jorge's work aims to help detained asylum seekers reach the stage in which an immigration judge fully hears and decides their claims, an increasingly difficult feat amid the expanded use of expedited removal. Jorge passionately believes that migration is a meaningful human right we cannot overlook despite the politics it may invoke. Your second speaker for today will be Zoe Boehm. So is the supervising attorney of the Detained Deportation Defense Team at Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center. Her practice focuses on asylum and removal defense and providing process support to people detained in El Paso and New Mexico. She has also, as a student attorney, she worked as a Northeastern's Immigrant Justice Clinic and organized street law clinics with the National Lawyers Guild. Prior to law school, she worked at the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center as a legal assistant and assisted in a variety of humanitarian visas, DACA, and citizenship applications. In her free time, she also loves mountain biking and climbing around New Mexico and West Texas. Your third speaker for today is Dan Stevens. Dan is a student and Ruben Presser Social Justice Fellow at Temple Law in Philadelphia. In the 10 years before entering law school, Dan worked as a public school teacher and union organizer. He is a longtime supporter of social movement and has professional campaign experience in electoral, community, and union contexts. At Temple, Dan is honing the legal skills needed to effectively fight for the rights of all workers, whether they are unionized, underage, incarcerated, or undocumented. Now I will pass it to Zoe Boehm.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. Like Yvonne said, I'm Zoe. I'm really excited to share some of our findings from our CFI orientation program report and hope that it can be helpful to your organizations as well, and that we can work together to continue to make these services better and also more accessible to more people in detention. So like Yvonne said, if you go to the next slide, I'm an attorney with Las Americas Detained Deportation Defense Team. Historically, we work at facilities in the El Paso ICE jurisdiction, and that includes the El Paso Processing Center here in El Paso, as well as 3 privately run detention centers in New Mexico, Otero, Torrance, and Cibola. Our focus has always been as a team to get people out of detention centers as soon as possible, whether that's through bond or parole or representing someone in immigration court, and more recently, by making sure people can pass their fear interviews so that they aren't deported before ever having a chance to have their case heard or to be considered for release. You go to the next slide. So I won't talk too much today about what expedited removal is, as I think many of you are very familiar, but I think that this chart is a helpful visual of the stakes of the credible fear interview process and puts it in perspective within the broader asylum process. So when someone enters the United States and doesn't otherwise have permission to be here, they're often placed into expedited removal proceedings. In expedited removal proceedings, non-citizens have very few rights and can be deported very quickly without ever going through court proceedings. In order to get out of expedited removal, non-citizens have to express fear of returning to their home country and then pass a credible fear interview so they can be moved from expedited removal into those full proceedings. If this process is happening in detention, it's almost always the case as well that asylum seekers won't be considered for release from detention by ICE until after they get a positive result on their credible fear interview. The credible fear interview takes place over the phone with an asylum officer, and it usually lasts about 3 hours. This interview is the asylum seeker's chance to show that there's a significant possibility that they'd qualify for asylum if they had a chance to present their case in a full hearing with an immigration judge down the road. So essentially, it's supposed to be a threshold screening. However, the Biden administration has taken steps to expand the use of expedited removal this past May through the Circumventing Lawful Pathways Law, or what advocates are calling the asylum ban. And we're calling it the asylum ban because it makes many people prima facie ineligible for asylum unless they entered with a CBP-1 appointment, another type of parole, or can show that there was an extenuating circumstance that they didn't do so. As a result, many people are being put through a more stringent version of the credible fear interview and are failing that interview. So essentially their case is ending before the chance that before they would ever have a chance to get together evidence and talk to a judge about their claim. Go to the next slide. So the harshness of the asylum ban and the expanded use of expedited removal, I think, is particularly stark this summer in the detention centers where we were at, particularly in Otero and Torrance. And there we met with a lot of people who had already lost their credible fear interview before we were ever able to reach them. They didn't know why they lost. They oftentimes never received a decision. They didn't know what their options were or really had any idea of what was going on in their immigration case. They had no access to counsel or ways to understand that the fear interview or ways to understand the credible fear interview process until they had already received that negative result, and deportation was inevitable. And oftentimes they're being deported back to life-threatening situations in their home countries and after having made months-long journeys to reach the United States. So that brings us to the purpose and mission of our CFI project this summer. We had the goal of using our volunteers and our summer interns to reach as many people as possible who were in expedited removal proceedings before they got to the place where they had already lost their credible fear interview and their options were really limited. We also wanted them to understand the exceptions to the asylum ban and overall feel like they have a better understanding of the asylum process in the United States and feel equipped to tell their own stories to the asylum officers in a way that would help them. We also wanted to learn more about how these fear interviews were being conducted in the different detention centers, especially in places like Torrance. They were fast tracking the credible fear interview process and having many people do them as quickly as possible. So we wanted to track any due process violations going on there. And that often doesn't get a lot of attention because the victims of this process are usually quickly deported without ever being able to really talk to anyone or given basic information about their rights in detention. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jorge, and he can discuss kind of the findings of our summer in this report.
I'm going to talk about the findings of our report, the practicalities of really putting this on the ground at these different detention centers. So I mentioned we used some undergraduate interns, 6 of them, 1 summer legal fellow, and we extensively first trained them on the topics that you see here on your screen: asylum withholding CAT, of course, a basic understanding of that, but also the context in which CFIs are happening and the context in which CFIs harm asylum claims for asylum seekers, which is why we explained also in the training expedited removal, the CLP rule, the circumvention of lawful pathways, and also any matters involving ICE custody and the HS complaint and any oversight mechanisms. Now, how did we find individuals that needed our help this summer? Well, a lot of them had direct contact with Las Americas, either by calling from the detention center themselves or having family and friends call us. Once we organized that together, we put it together in a list. We determined the procedural posture, whether or not they had received their CFI via 2 government websites, one of them being the EOIR's automated case information, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. You input an A number and it gives you any upcoming hearings. We used that in combination with ICE's online detainee locator system, and it proved very helpful and also very successful. We only turned up false positives a few times, and by that I mean Once we input someone's A number, they didn't show up, but they were on ICE's website. They were still detained, and sometimes some of those people already had fear interviews, so we got to them a little bit too late, not enough to prepare them. But it was just a few of those situations. It was mostly successful, the screening method. If I can hit the next slide, please. So this is Otero County Processing Center. Just wanted to get a visual of where this is at. There's absolutely nothing around, and it's about a 40-minute drive away from El Paso, the city itself, in Chaparral, New Mexico. And if I can give you a visual of the El Paso Processing Center, which is a little bit more in our urban area, very near the El Paso Airport. That's another of the detention centers that we touched on and that I will be talking about today. If I can get the next slide, please. So let's talk about a little bit about the structure a little bit more. Our first visit took place June 6th of this year. Our last visit took place August 9th. At Otero, we visited at least twice a week, and any additional days during the week we took, depending on the work, to do administrative tasks, which involve uploading all of our different documents and intakes and into our different systems here at Las Americas, just to keep track of the data in different systems. And as far as why EPPC this bullet, well, Otero was our main focus along with Torrance, because these two detention centers were being used to place asylum seekers in expedited removal. Most of them were people who were going to have a CFI, but at one point during the summer, we found a pace in Otero, and we ended up running out of the people who had contacted us that needed a CFI preparation, a CFI orientation, excuse me. So at that point, we had to turn to EPPC for a few of those orientations. As far as quality control of the CFI orientation session itself, well, I really wanted to make sure that we started with a slow pace, right? By that, I meant one session each intern per visit, right? That's how we started off. At some point, we leveled up all the way to 3 sessions each intern per visit. The supervision of these visits was really, I was there for in-session question and answers. If there was any sort of issue that came about that just was kind of not the norm, or the asylum seeker was asking about something and obviously the interns or our summer legal fellow could not give any legal advice, then we'd definitely step in. But there was also post-visit debriefing, just to ensure that our interns, when writing our intake summaries, were classifying these asylum claims in the correct group, whether it be PSG or political opinion, etc. And also the supervision, the quality control of these orientation sessions was done through also a review of the intake summary. What was the asylum claim? Was it classified correctly? Or is there anything else we should be asking? If you can go ahead and hit the next slide, please. Now, as far as the materials that we used for the CFI orientation project, well, we created a CFI orientation intake form, and our report has links to all of this, all of these materials. We made them available to you in hopes that maybe you'd take some inspiration and replicate some of this, or just engage with these materials in some way, shape, or form. The first half of the intake form is really a typical intake. You have your name, A number, birthday, any family in the US, all sorts of things that you would ask typically during an intake, just to collect information, biographical information and otherwise. But once we got into the actual orientation aspect of the form, it was divided in 3 modules, and all of this is scripted for our interns, but I definitely encourage them at some point to make the script theirs, not to just simply follow it. The first module, we teach detained asylum seekers about asylum law in the US, in combination with a very creative little diagram called La Manita, the little hand, which essentially is your finger. Each finger represents a question that we believe if you answer, you'll be in really good shape for your credible fear interview. The second module was about the CFI basics, like what is actually going to happen during the CFI. This module was really made looking at a record of a credible fear interview. What questions come first? When do you start talking about your asylum claim? We explain that to the detained asylum seekers, and we also, with the guidance of the regulations that orchestrate CFIs, we created a what to know document. And again, all of this is available in the report. The what to know document comes after the CFI basics because this document explains essentially more or less what should be happening at a credible fear interview, what an asylum officer may or may not do, or what you as a detained asylum seeker undergoing this interview may or may not do. Our third module, the CFI orientation, essentially ends with 4 essential tips that we explain to asylum seekers and some practice questions for the asylum seekers. Will consider us the asylum officer conducting the CFI during that practice session. If I can go ahead and hit the next slide, please. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about what we actually found out once we were in Otero and once we were in El Paso Processing Center. Well, in Otero, we found a lot of hostility. Prior to starting the pilot project, we, Las Americas, were engaged in 2 CRCL complaints concerning gender discrimination. So coming into building this project, I knew there were probably going to be some issues of discrimination against vulnerable groups. And sure enough, during the actual pilot project period, we had to make a CRCL complaint for someone who was facing discrimination based on their sexuality. We also encountered hostility the very first time I set foot with the interns in Otero. We had a bit of a, I use standoff very lightly, but we were asked to provide documentation that the interns were either paralegals or in some way, shape, or form legal representatives to be able to visit the detained asylum seekers. But that worked out. It took a little bit, but we were able to make that first visit then and there, but they were asking questions of us that are not typical. If I can get the next slide, please. Now, in Otero, we experienced a lot of long waiting periods to undergo a CFI. For example, we had the case of Brian, who spent 108 days in Otero before he was given a CFI. I really believe that amid all of the names and all the people, they really forgot about him. So we ended up spending 108 days waiting for a CFI. We provided an orientation session for him sometime in early June. He called us sometime in September that he still had not received a CFI. So what we did was engage with the asylum office in Houston, got Brian to sign a G28, and we essentially requested a CFI just to make sure that they had not forgotten about him. And although the 108-day wait in Otero for Brian was one of the longest periods that we saw, we did see several individuals who had been waiting over 2 months for their interviews. In EPPC, El Paso Service Processing Center, we had kind of the reverse, where the CFI wait time was okay, but at EPCC, post CFI, we had NTA issuance issues. Nico, for example, spent 18 days waiting for a court that he ended up missing. In other words, he did not receive an NTA for 18 days. Once the NTA arrived, that court has passed and ended up delaying the very first court post CFI. This was not only Nico's case, as he and 19 other individuals who were in the same position did a brief hunger strike at EPPC to essentially demand information from the deportation officers as to when their next court would be, just because they had not received any NTA post CFI. If I can get the next slide, please. We also had issues with interpreters, both in Otero and EPPC. The issues with interpreters were that, well, interpreters were asking asylum seekers, just answer yes or no to these questions. Please give us brief responses, even though these questions entail a lot of detail and required. And sometimes the interpreters either were demanding that that the asylum seekers were answering in yes or no format or in a very brief manner. And if the asylum seeker did not comply with this, we also documented instances when interpreters essentially interrupted mid-response to translate what had been said, and then the CFI would move on without the rest of the answer provided by the asylum seekers. This was specifically very concerning for a lot of the people that we followed up with post CFI. They really thought that the fact that they didn't include the detail that they wanted to was fatal for their CFI. So those were the 3 main issues, the 3 main trends that I really saw in Otero and EPPC this summer. If I can get the next slide, please. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about the program results before we actually get into the data that we collected. Overall, we had 73 CFI orientation sessions from, as I said, June 6th through August 9th. 56 took place in Otero, 11 in Torrance, and 6 at EPPC. Again, just to reiterate, EPPC didn't have such a large number because that detention center wasn't really our focus until we ran out of names at Otero for a little bit and kind of had to seek out more individuals who were in need of a CFI orientation in Otero. Our overall pass rate, I'm very proud to say, is a 91.6%, which was 65 asylum seekers who obtained a positive. 92.6% of our 56 Otero orientations were also a positive. All of our 11 Torrance sessions were a positive, and 4 out of 6 of our EPPC sessions were a positive, which is the 66.7% that you see on your screen. And when you compare these numbers to the Houston Asylum Office during the same time period, June through August, they had an approximately 60% pass rate, which just really goes to show the success that this intervention, this early intervention had to the CFI orientation program. If I can just show you a few more numbers. As far as Otero, well, this is the breakdown of countries. Primarily, we saw people from South America, followed by some Central American countries. And then we had in EPPC some outliers, in Otero, like Pakistan, and in EPCC, for example, Nigeria, but Venezuelan asylum seekers is really what we saw most of this summer. If I can get the next slide, please. As far as asylum claim types, we had 42 individuals claiming persecution based on membership in a particular social group, which was quite a lot. And it, of course, as you all know, it's really have been a developing aspect of asylum law for the last 3 decades or so. We had several individuals as far as political opinion claims, especially from Venezuela, for race or ethnicity claims. And some of these we classified as both an asylum claim that they may be classified as, or also maybe if they fall under the protections under CAT. And we had of those 41 individuals, 41% of individuals who had a claim involving the Convention Against Torture. If I can get the next slide, please. As far as gender breakdown, mostly men, 95.2%, 59 individuals, and only 3 individuals were women at the Otero County Processing Center. If I can get the next slide, please. And as far as CBP1, we were able to track that 26.8% of the individuals that we were able to have contact with actually used the CBP1 app and obtained something. In EPPC, we had 33.3%, only 2 individuals that entered with a CBP1 appointment, both of them positive. And as far as the CBP1 appointments in Otero, 14 of them were positive. 1 actually did not have a CFI. But with this, I will go ahead and pass it on to Daniel Simmons. Thank you all very much for your attendance here today.
Thank you, Jorge. Hi, everybody. Thanks for your time. So Jorge laid out, I think, quite cogently some of the data that this was a successful intervention. And I'd like to give a more qualitative description of what the same project looked like at a quite different facility. That's the Torrance County Detention Facility. It's pictured there right on the slide. It's a place where nobody wants to spend much time. And I want to describe a bit about what that preparation looked like with our intern team, of whom I was one. And we just tried to improve our intern skills, and this is over the course of about 8 weeks visiting the facility, of what it meant to help detained people tell the best version, and by best I mean most legally persuasive version of their story. So there was a really careful foundation laid in basic organizing skills. What does it mean to be a good listener? What does it mean to both have a goal, which is to suss out legally relevant facts, while also making sure someone is comfortable enough to tell stories that are of anguish, of trauma, of all the things that I'm sure you're all very familiar are the norm when working with detained people in ICE facilities. Some of the things that we found were most useful in training our volunteers at Torrance was just workshopping. So we did extensive role plays based on, again, with story-based advocacy here. The role plays we did were based on a mix of reading redacted files of real stories, of practicing just volunteer to volunteer, and also setting up peer mentorship roles so that after volunteers would have gone in and spent the day collaborating with Know Your Rights workshops, small group discussions with detainees, writing of declarations with detainees at Torrance, finding out what worked and what didn't, and really trying to hone our skills. So in the last month of getting to meet with detained people at Torrance, we had 100% of everyone we met and prepared for their credible fear interview pass their credible fear interview. So it was an incredibly satisfying process. But I also want to mention some key differences of how this program rolled out at Torrance. So the main difference is that at the Torrance facility, detainees were getting their CFI interviews as quickly as the staff could make them happen. We believe that was a direct result of the efficacy of our program. Whenever detained people spoke with us before their CFI, they tended to pass. And so we did a mix of, we'd go into the visitation room. There might be anywhere from 10 to 60 detained people. And we would, again, as they did in Otero, just try and identify what the case posture was of a given detainee. From that point, we would provide them with whatever service possible. And it really just came down to giving detainees a relationship, a lower stakes environment to understand the legal consequences of whatever process they were in. And sometimes it was as simple as trying to explain to detainees what the deportation process looked like when they were in the process thereof. A few cases that come to mind when I think about how our CFI training really shaped the trajectory of some of the folks we worked with. Esteban, who's from Ecuador, he had a story of political persecution. He was run out of his town violently by an opposing political party, but came with the false assumption that being able to move forward with his asylum claim was based on simply describing his qualifications as a good worker, his love of America, a kind of false idea that his goodness, his potential citizenshipness for the United States was going to be a legal claim. And so simply emphasizing to Esteban that describing the dimension of his persecution, that he was part of a minority political party, that he had the state working against him, that helped him reframe the way he told his story. And luckily we got to him before his CFI. Carmelo in Guatemala, he had a horrifying story of being hurt by a neighbor, but it took Carmelo until his second telling of his story to mention that this neighbor was a police officer, and that, in fact, from a legal standpoint, Carmelo is being persecuted by the police, which, as you all know, is a much different and more persuasive claim for allowing him to pass his credible fear process. Finally, Miguel in Honduras did not realize that his identity as a gay man was a protected category and that it was relevant to his claim. He thought the opposite, that it would cause his claim to not move forward. Most of what we did as volunteers is tell people to say more. A lot of the questions we would ask, and it's based on the same modules and tools that Jorge introduced. Looking over La Manita is an incredibly elegant way to just remind people, who did that? Where were you from? What happened when you tried to seek help? And the tools that we used were so simple that we found detained people at Torrance were sharing them with one another without our needing to be there. So there was a sort of dual dynamic from our intervention. The first was that our tools were so shareable that it was very easy to, within 5 or 10 minutes, give sound advice to someone we might not see again. But also, because the tools were so shareable, detainees were sharing them with one another, even when we were unable to access our clients. A few other things I'd like to emphasize. So at Torrance, there were a few prominent problems in our ability to really prepare detainees as we would have liked. First was a lack of privacy. So we told, according to regulation, that the CFI interview would be taking place in a private room. Having personally been able to go on a tour with other coalition members of the CFI interview rooms, they were anything but private, and forcing detainees to tell these stories in earshot of one another, especially the most traumatic and violent stories, obviously had a chilling effect on detainees' comfort level in telling these stories. In addition to lack of privacy that we saw happening at the facility, there was a real uneven policy about whether staff at the facility would be in the visitation room or not when Las Americas staff was in that room. And so there was a real suspicion about whether guards, many of whom would pretend not to speak Spanish, but in fact did speak Spanish, would be in the room with us. Another continuous problem throughout our visitation program, our CFI prep program that is, was that detainees were frequently deprived of food during the duration of our visits. At times we were able to make sure that food was brought late, but we learned that one of the means by which detainees were dissuaded from joining some of these legal visits before they knew what they were about, before they knew we were trusted allies, was that the reputation got around that if you came to one of these sessions, you might miss lunch. Even outside of our visits, we learned that there was a sort of selective deprivation of water in different units within the facility that seemed to track somewhat with the units that contained detainees we had been speaking with. There was a rampant abuse of quarantine protocols. Obviously, any facility needs to be careful about COVID quarantine. It seemed to us that COVID was used frequently to say that our clients were not available. In my last 2 weeks of this program, I was personally disallowed from the facility along with a colleague because they told us we had been contaminated, but refused to answer any details about how that had happened. In addition to the CFI training program, because we had so relatively few detainees who needed specifically CFI prep, we pivoted to a lot of data collection. That data collection at Torrance took the form of declaration writing workshops. If you could move 2 slides over, please. It's a piece of paper. That is exactly what a declaration writing workshop would have entailed, but we had bilingual templates to help detainees describe the entire breadth of their migration story, as well as focused questions about detention conditions at Torrance. We worked with so many hundreds of detainees that these declarations, when we were able to categorize them into different facets of all the violations going on at Torrance, that it formed the basis of our formal complaint about the ways in which food deprivation, privacy issues, uneven security, quarantine abuse, physical abuse of detainees, and frequent denial of due process rights of detainees. We are able to have a stack of really persuasive testimony from our detainees based on having the time to help detainees write careful declarations after having explained to them what the legal process is all about and what elements might be most effective in pressuring Torrance to shut down or second best improve its ways. The last thing I want to mention is that the intervention's effectiveness, CFI prep, is not something that needs to be done entirely by legal experts. What we did was we're people who know the law. Again, as a law student, we have other just undergraduate interns helping, but that it's an incredibly low cost but high impact method of giving detainees precisely the tools they need to have their best possible leverage over what I'm sure we agree is an oppressive legal environment. With this in mind, the kind of practice, the workshops, the tools we've developed are something that are really ready to deploy in any other detention facility in the country. And we do hope that with your questions and future collaboration, that we're able to really take the lessons of this summer and replicate it. With that in mind, we've got other recommendations, and I'd like to pass to my supervising attorney, Zoe Bowman.
Thanks, Dan. So now I'd like to talk about some recommendations before turning it over to you all for questions. Before I get started with the recommendations for administrative agencies, Las Americas really believes in the abolition of immigrant detention centers as a whole and stands against the Biden administration's asylum ban. However, we do have several harm reduction steps and recommendations for administrative agencies that they could take to make sure that more people aren't deported to dangerous situations without any due process. So first, I think it's important to institute and facilitate guidance that encourages access to pro bono legal services for people in expedited removal. In our experience in Torrance, for example, like Dan was saying, we were prevented from seeing asylum seekers until essentially after they already went through the credible fear interview process. And it was really essential for us to document that and to report that to groups like the CRCL and OIG. We also have had a lot of problems with USCIS not contacting us when we're directly representing someone for their fear interview, or having a fear interview be scheduled on a Sunday morning with no notice to a legal representative, so they're not able to get that call and represent their client. I also wanted to address due process concerns, including the timely administration of an interview and notification of its result. So I think sometimes, for example, in Otero, people were not given the opportunity to be released from detention until, months because they're waiting for that fear interview. And then the flip side of that is a situation like in Torrance, where they were given a fear interview after a couple of days and really not given any chance to be given like a legal orientation. We also think it's important for the asylum office to address poor interpretation quality during an interview and acknowledge that that can impact someone's answers and their success in the interview. And then on ICE's end, putting an end to detention center staff arbitrarily taking asylum seekers' documentary evidence and getting rid of it or taking it away. We also think it's important that the administration acknowledges language access barriers in this process and stop the administration of a credible fear interview if an interpreter is not available for a particular language. And this would really prevent rare language speakers and particularly Indigenous people from receiving negative CFIs just because they're forced to have their interview in a language that they're not fluent in, not comfortable in. And the last thing is to develop a comprehensive policy guidelines that would outline the use or practice of prosecutorial discretion upon specific categories of vulnerable asylum seekers who should not be subjected to a credible fear interview or should be given notice to appear regardless of the result of their fear interview. And this would include trafficking victims, people between the ages of 18 and 21 who are eligible for special immigrant juvenile status, people who report mistreatment in detention, and individuals who are part of a family group that have a pending immigration application going. And so now I'll turn it back over to Dan for some other recommendations specifically for other legal service providers like Las Americas.
Thank you, Zoe. So I think some of these recommendations for legal service providers are consonant with what I said earlier, but want to get a little bit more specific about them because, again, what we found is low cost, high impact, right? We need more people doing this work and need not reinvent the wheel to help get more people past the credible fear stage and also just divert entirely from it. So early basic interventions like CFI prep are an effective and good use of resources. We have people who are the first time entrants into the immigration law field, first time they've ever set foot in a detention facility, are providing incredibly meaningful support to detainees and allowing them to seek asylum. So training volunteers to scale up the impact and number of people we can reach is an easy thing that can be done by non-legal experts. And finally, the success of interventions of challenging negative credible fear interviews depends on our asylum office and immigration judges. We have a lot to learn. We found that certainly at Torrance, the fact that we were in constant communication with immigration judges, with our asylum officials, with ICE officials, certainly seemed to move towards a greater adherence to the regulations because we continually complained when detainees' rights of privacy, of language access, of rescheduling if they were sick, rescheduling if a detainee requested having an observer at their interview, that we were able to make progress on those goals, and other legal aid organizations can dramatically move that trend in the right direction. Something as simple as, well, just simply having people explain what the CBP1 app is on both sides of the border, and letting detainees know, asylum seekers know that that's their first meaningful opportunity to explain what their attempt at getting to the United States is one of many priorities that we think is just a missed opportunity at the moment for the immigration justice movement in providing basic legal support. And I will leave it there, and hope to pass on to all of you for your questions and further discussion.
If you have any questions, feel free to come off mute or put it down on the chat. Okay, we have one question from Brianna Perez. Did Las Americas project represent individuals in their CFI or subsequent IJ review?
Hey, I can address that question. So we did do some of that, especially towards the beginning of this summer. One thing that we noticed was happening with IJ reviews, particularly after it seemed like the administration was really trying to accelerate the rate of deportations and getting as many people through the process as possible, is that the IJ reviews started happening 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, with pretty much no notice to counsel or to the person in detention of when that IJ review would be. So it became very difficult just logistically to agree to represent someone under those conditions. And then as well, when I would represent people at IJ reviews, it seems like they had all been told that they're not allowed to, or they're not supposed to let counsel speak during the IJ review hearing. I turned in documents beforehand and was told that they weren't going to look at it. So at least in the El Paso and Otero immigration courts, it seemed like we weren't able to make a lot of progress, and we're putting a lot of effort initially into IJ review without really seeing the fruits of that. And then let me just see the second part of that question. And then, for representation during the CFI, that was also something that we tried to do and came across some logistical challenges just because we never knew when they were going to be happening. I was able to do that for one person, again, early on, and I did actually think it was effective. The asylum officer I worked with allowed me to ask some questions at the end and to provide a closing statement. So it's definitely something I'd like to do more of in the future.
And I just want to add to Zoe's illustration about the difficulty of trying to represent clients in front of immigration judges, is we were told candidly by an immigration judge who said, well, I've only got 15 or 20 minutes for all these. I've got to run through them today. And so not only were our motions not getting read, the judge was told, get the process moving along. And we had, of hundreds over the summer, almost nobody passed their immigration judge review. So it's in terms of where do you deploy limited resources, it seems not very tactical compared to the benefits of the CFI prep.
Hi, I'm Olivia Dalva. I have a question. I'm an intern here with Las Americas. I was just wondering, do the asylum seekers there, when they're gonna get their peer interview, do they have like an appointment date? Or is it something that they just kind of like one day just wake up and then find out that that's the day of their interview?
Think on this question, and there's no appointment set. The times that we did reach out to the Houston Asylum Office concerning individuals who had been waiting for a while, all we were told is just to be patient, that they couldn't even give us an approximation of kind of a week, what week and what month it would take place. And from speaking to asylum seekers, sometimes some of those that work at a detention center were just randomly pulled from their job and we're just going to have a CFI that day. So yeah, it was just at random. They had no appointment.
And at Torrance, especially, when we would have folks like, write the elements of their story down, have a copy of La Manita on them, we just instructed them to walk around with it at all times, because people were being brought to CFI interviews during meals, during recreation, directly from their cells, and no warning on that. IJ reviews usually had a date with a couple weeks notice.
If there are no more questions, we can move to the next slide.
Well, I simply just want to thank you once again for your attendance here today. We truly believe this is meaningful work. We truly believe that going forward, this will be the regime in which asylum seekers will be put into. The CFI will be the screening that will be the barrier for them to get to an immigration judge and fully get an adjudication of their claim. So we really believe that there should be a focus on this. And again, simply wanted to thank all of our different interns, the Colorado College, Notre Dame, as well as Barnard College, Temple University. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. And Chicago University as well. Yes, thank you very much. And I simply wanted to remind everyone, as we kind of mentioned throughout the webinar, the report itself has hyperlinks with the actual materials that we were referencing, the La Manita, the what to know, the different modules, the intake form itself. Once you are able to get your hands on the report, those links work and will take you directly to the materials. So thank you very much for your attendance once more.
We will be sending a copy of the report to all of you as well this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.